Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. You can find us on the Compliance Podcast Network with a host of other great podcasts about compliance. You can also find us on Corporate Compliance Insights, where we have our very own page dedicated to the podcast, and we're thrilled to share our origin story on there as well. Today's episode is called Ask Us Anything, and the idea for this show is that because Lisa and I spend so much time asking other people questions, we thought that we'd make ourselves available to go into the hot seats and ask the audience if there's anything that they wanted to know about us. And you all delivered. So today's episode is a compilation of solicited questions that we've received from you over the last several weeks. And we'll take turns supplying our answers. And then at the end, we'll also take an opportunity to ask each other a question that we'd like to put to the other person. So without further ado, we should get this show on the road. And my first question is for, it's for both of us, but I'll ask it first and put it to Lisa. What inspired you to start the podcast?
Well, I think, Mary, first of all, I am so excited about doing this. And I think it's a great thing that we started having these different kinds of conversations as we come back from what we call our hiatus. But one thing, I think that the way the podcast started in our origin story is we were at an SCCE conference, as many of you know, and we were talking to Tom Fox, whose name you'll hear us mention a couple times today, about different podcasts on the Compliance Podcast Network. So a group of us were talking about this and that there weren't any women-hosted podcasts on that network. And Tom immediately said, "What about you all?" And I think we both thought it was a really interesting, fun idea and aligned with our objectives of what, we wanted to do with the community and with the, in the future, but didn't really know how it would happen. And there was a part of me that wasn't sure whether or not that was just kind of, talk at the bar. But then 2 days later, Tom interviewed us, and then we decided we were going to start this and move forward. And it really was something that aligned very much with something that we are very excited about and passionate about, which is women and compliance in this community. So that was my part of the origin story. What about you?
I think you've said everything. I don't really have anything to add to that, except that I do remember, and I think you were the same, we were really excited about having a new project to do and an opportunity to work with someone, and close to being a colleague's relationship that we don't actually go to the office with every day in terms of our core jobs. So it was a really exciting way to try something new and get to work with people that are my friends in compliance as well. That's all I have to add. Your explanation of how it came about was exactly as I remembered it.
Yeah, it turned out to be quite special. I think we both think that. So I'm going to move on. The next question that we received was, what role does your bachelor's degree play in reaching the top? And now for you and I, that's different because internationally, a bachelor's degree is equivalent to your university degree. In the United States, we have high school and then college or university, and initially, which is where you have an undergraduate degree, which is often the bachelor's degree. So why don't you start with the international perspective?
And the first thing I would say is that I'd have to let you know when I do reach the top what the actual answer to this is. But in terms of where I am now and a little bit of perspective for those who don't have the same schooling system as we do in New Zealand, we are in the very advantageous position of law being a degree that you can do straight out of high school. So I started my law degree at the tender age. I just freshly turned 18, and I rolled out of law school at 21 years old. Had there been a court session available for us to get admitted to the bar as a barrister and solicitor before my 22nd birthday, which rolled around just after Christmas, I would have been admitted to the bar at 21 years old as well. So that's very different contrast to the American system. And so I see it as being excellent because it meant that I hit the working market a few years before counterparts in the US. And I always knew that I wanted to do my law degree and not study a whole host of other things at that particular point of my life. I was just as is, very much my personality and style. I just wanted to get out there and start doing things. And so I did. And what I would say is that the extent to which my bachelor's degree, and in this case, an LLB or a Bachelor of Laws, as we call it at home, it's played a role, but not necessarily the specific subject, if you will, is always pertinent to what I'm trying to do. So what I would say is that there's a lot that you can do with all sorts of degrees generally, and whatever you get your degree in, I think we know is not necessarily going to be the actual thing you end up practicing. So I'm really glad that I took the time to do my bachelor's degree because it was super interesting for me. And at that time, I did want to be a private practice lawyer. So it was useful in terms of what I thought I wanted to do in my late teens, early 20s. And of course, that evolves as time goes on and you figure out what it is that you really desire and are in fact good at, as opposed to what you thought you wanted to do when you were, much, much younger and had been exposed to less things. So I would say it plays a certain role in terms of getting you along your travels. However, far more influential is going to be a host of other things. And one of the key ones for me is grasping opportunities when you see them, even if they're not what you had planned initially, or they're not how you thought your life would pan out, but critically analyzing doors that open and asking yourself, is there scope for me to advance myself in some way or try something new that might benefit me further down the track? So the bachelor's degree is useful, but not critical to your eventual success.
Yeah, and I'll add from a U.S. perspective, I think it is very helpful to get into the field to have the bachelor or the undergraduate degree, so you're not just coming straight out of what we call high school. I know you said that in New Zealand it's college, but you're coming out at 18. You really, the college or university degree is really going to help you get yourself into the field, where I think that's a barrier sometimes in terms of applying or other things. Now, whether or not that's right is kind of a separate discussion. But I think if you get into an organization, you don't have that degree and you get into compliance, I think, once you're there, it's not necessarily dispositive. But I think it's harder it's one fewer barrier. And I don't think that's similar from a lot of jobs at corporations, I think, these days. But with that said, I also know people who fell into it and ended up getting an undergraduate degree while they were working, or didn't, and seem to have come to gotten really great opportunities and done a great job with it. I just think it is one thing that can be a barrier. Now, for the top, I don't think it changes getting to the top, because once you're in, like you said, you got to take the opportunities, and you also have to decide what you want and what you define as the top. Because what I may define as the top to me is different than somebody else. So I think that is really my take on it. And I think with that, it's a good way to segue into the next question, which is, now that we've talked about bachelor degree, is a law degree essential for being a compliance officer? And
absolutely not. Yeah, I've said many times on our podcast that I think people are doing themselves an incredible disservice if they have teams that essentially from a technical perspective and an educational perspective are not diverse. So I recognize, however, there are some companies which have chosen to put their compliance function within a legal department, and that may therefore make them more inclined to look for people who are legally qualified. However, it doesn't preclude you from hiring non-lawyers, even if your compliance function sits within the legal department. And I would strongly encourage diversity. Mark Stanley, who I interviewed a long while ago now on the podcast, one of his tactics, if you will, for building out a really strong team is acknowledging his own weaknesses and being self-aware of them, and then making sure that he plugs those gaps with people who have the strengths that he doesn't. So if you happen to be someone with a law degree, that's great, but it's certainly not essential for how you might build out the rest of your team or expect your peers to be equally educated. Absolutely not essential in my book. Lisa?
Mine either. I mean, I think it's not essential. I think it's important to have a diverse team. Mm-hmm. I think you would probably want on a compliance team maybe one person that has a legal background. But I also think having somebody who's got forensic accounting background, who has expertise in many areas, or knows the company and has done different things. I think exactly like as Mark says, or others, I think having a team with different strengths and different subject matter backgrounds is really important. I don't think it's essential. I think it's essential. An essential skill is to be able to put together a diverse team that includes all different areas, and to be able to, have different people lead different things. But I think that companies are going to miss some really great candidates and really great CCOs if you're only going to look at people with law degrees.
Yeah, and the last couple of years in particular, studies have finally come out which do confirm that diversity in your teams makes for higher performing teams. So if you're, of the sort of the mindset of hiring for people like you, I recommend looking up some of those studies to help understand better about how we as humans tend to hire people who are like ourselves in terms of similar demographics. Be aware of that, acknowledge it, and then challenge yourself to look for people who bring added dimensions, experience, and perspectives than what you can bring to the table.
Okay.
Excellent. All right. So the next question is, what is your process for identifying the great women that you interview?
All right. Well, I think, this is one thing that we get this question a lot and we try to answer it, but it's from many, many different ways and different sources. There are some people that we've looked at as leaders in the field and that we think are people that we really feel like have been great women, and we want to recognize that. We've had suggestions. We've suggestions of other people, whether it's from individuals about themselves or about other people. We have a lot of different ways do that. We also, in something that we're doing now, and I think when we were talking a minute ago about diversity on teams as a whole, diversity and also, racial discrimination and diversity has become a huge topic globally, but particularly that was started in the U.S. right now with the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd. And this is something, for example, that I'm using this as an example because you and I both have talked about this and care about it a lot as something to bring into the podcast. So one of the things that we've done is put a call out for some speakers on some of the different areas related to this, which we'll be doing as part of the podcast for the next couple months. So we generally, like different angles from different people on a lot of things, but given that this is an important topic right now, I think we wanted to address it. And just spoiler alert, one of the things we'll talk about is hiring, making it, what can we do as compliance officers in organizations? What about implicit bias? What about, we talk about bringing the elevator. How do we mentor? How do we do this? And, at a time where, racial diversity is a huge thing in the United States, how do we do better? And I think that that's just an example of one kind of thought for us right now, but one way that the podcast evolves differently. We've always been proud about the diversity of guests we've had. And I think that's an important thing to us. And I just wanted to sort of flag that in here. And then, you can also talk about some of the other things that we think about. But I think that's one thing we're both really proud of, is the ability to do that and hear voices here.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And thank you for being such a good driver of diversity for us. Some of the other ways in which we've identified our guests for this show, Lisa and I, at conferences or being in the audience of webinars, we've heard someone speak. We think they have a compelling point to make, and we've invited them that way. We've also had referrals. So this is really great to see women and men amplifying the voices of others in the community and suggesting people that they know that they think would make great guests for this show. So we've identified people from referrals, and then self-referrals as well, which is when women who have heard about the show or listened to it themselves have thought, I have something that I think could be value add for this podcast, and then they contact us, and we talk about angles which we could bring to the audience. So there are a variety of different ways, and I'm sure that we will discover new ways of identifying guests, but I would say those are the main ones. And Lisa, I'd just go back to you to check on if there's anything that I missed off the top of your head for that list.
No, I mean, I think when people ask us about the process, sometimes they think we have like a detailed questionnaire / process of doing this. And frankly, I get really excited about that, because that sounds like we've got a, some sort of qualitative, quantitative, all the big, word analyses. We just like interesting viewpoints that we can all learn from, and that, help build the community. And if we had like one process, we might lose some of that. So I think that's something that's really important to us. And with that, I think I'll turn to our next question. This was one I really like. If a new regulation in one market sets a higher standard than exists in other markets, and the example here was modern slavery, do you focus on implementation in that one market, or start there and socialize across the company?
Yeah, so referring back to the legal background, my very obvious answer is it depends. And I think it depends usually on the subject matter at hand. So one that comes to mind that I've seen companies uniformly follow the same process for is when we take the anti-bribery and corruption topic. Companies generally take the strictest of the long arm laws and apply those across the board. So a really easy example is Foreign Corrupt Practices Act does not prohibit facilitation payments. UK Bribery Act does. So companies that fall under both of those laws, and of course, it's very difficult to think of a multinational company that doesn't trigger both of them. In that case, companies tend to prohibit facilitation payments across the board. So they go with the stricter reading of what the UK Bribery Act says. However, for other subject matter areas, I think it's very much a risk assessment or risk analysis is conducted in respect of the particular risk at hand, and what each market or jurisdiction beyond the one at issue has to offer in terms of whether it proportionately makes sense to introduce the new control or whatever the step may be into the other countries. And so you may decide that your existing controls and compliance program are sufficient to address the risk in a certain, in every other market in which you operate. And the one in which there is a stricter rule put in place, you may not even have considered that necessary for that particular market in the first place, but you're following it because you have to. So it's going to depend on the specific risk that you have, the proportionality of the effort that it's going to take to roll out that control to the rest of the compliance program, and whether the risk in those countries warrants you doing that. Lisa, what do you think?
I absolutely think you've covered almost all of it. The one point that I would just add to that is you also really need to look at what your company is doing, your specific organization.
Yeah, good point.
Just because when a regulation comes out, you have to pay attention to it, but some will impact you more and some will impact you more in other places. And I guess my legal background will come back out too with the it depends part of it, because, if there's something that comes, that's very, something very financially oriented, the financial regulations or anti-fraud or things like that. If you're a bank, the way you handle that is going to be very different than you're going to handle it if you're, selling widgets, So that was also a law school analogy we used back in the day.
In New Zealand as well, we use that in economics.
Yep. But that's I think thinking about the important thing is to both look at the new regulations, but also look at the new regulations and assess your company specific risks. Because those will really, really vary. I think that's the thing that I would add to that. Do you have anything else from your end?
No, but that one was an excellent one. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Excellent. Okay, so the next question, a little bit of a different topic here. As compliance officers, what has surprised you the most about the pandemic?
Well, first of all, the as compliance officers could change. If I took that off, I'd have a whole lot of other things. we have done a conversation about that. But with that said, I feel like for me, it's almost the quote of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because suddenly it felt like everything in terms of how you ran as a company changed. Now, so that meant, what were your risks before? What are your risks, during this? What will be your risks afterwards? How do we assess them looking at a compliance framework and also help a business? It's very, challenged in this time to, many of them to basically rework how some of the things people do every day and be a good team and stuff like that. So how do we use the compliance function to really show the business we're there for them, which means if for example, in my mind, if you were supposed to do a whole bunch of gifts and hospitality targeted training for people and they're not leaving their houses for a few months, this may be a time where some parts of the organization will say, yeah, we're home. We have some additional time. Let's do this. And on the other hand, some people will say, we have these 10 new risks. Can you help us work through those? So changing your program is, the more things change. When I say the more things stay the same, I mean, this offers a lot of other anti-bribery, anti-corruption risks that we've never seen before because of the way business was changing globally, different places over time, different risks, the response of it, working as a community with the people within your team. But at the same time, when there's new opportunities for bad actors, and bad actors will maybe change the way they work. So we still need to be working and being vigilant. It's just the circumstances are different. So that's kind of what, I saw, and I'm not sure if that was surprising or not, but that to me is one of the larger lessons to me.
Yeah. So I'd say generally, which I think is how intuitively we want to answer this question, just throw away the as compliance officers, but I'll sort of narrow into that a little bit more in a moment. What surprised me was the domino effect, sort of the chain reaction of how one thing, like a linchpin moment, had the ability to permeate every single area of our lives, including our work lives. It was like glitter, it was everywhere and you could not get away from it. And the smallest thing that you thought would be normal and the same in your life was somehow impacted by coronavirus. So what surprised me was just how little processes that we normally have in the office or things that we do as a matter of course had to change and alter in terms of accommodating, what was referred to as the new normal. So I just wasn't prepared for it. I wasn't prepared for anything that would challenge globalization in any way. I thought we'd always be moving forward, like onwards and upwards, that globalization is a good thing and we want to see it advance. And yet our lives have been changed and have turned on a dime. And the office is, no exception to that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we're now jumping around because these are, again, in the Ask Me Anything format. We had lots of different kinds of interesting questions. So, and I love that you got to use the word glitter because I know you do like the glitter.
I
got to pull that in.
I like sparkles.
This is another fun part about doing a podcast. We'll talk about this later. Is getting to work with your friends and be able to call out fun things like this. But based on our interviews. Is there a pattern in the experiences of the GWICs? So what do you think, Mary?
Yeah, absolutely. I basically have a canned answer that I can roll out whenever this topic comes up, and it's one of my favorite things. And we saw pretty quickly a trend in terms of the characteristics and the traits of the women on the podcast. And these were inevitably people who always give back to the community. They're not selfish and self-absorbed and caring only about their own career and upward trajectory. These are people who give back, and I like to use the term, as many of you know now, they send the elevator back down. They make sure that they're when they reach a position that they're proud to be in and know that they have the ability to give something back, they do so freely. They know that when they light someone else's candle, it does not diminish the flame of their own. And if you're wondering about the science behind this, because in fact, I don't believe it's a coincidence, read the book Give and Take by organizational psychologist Adam Grant, and it'll help you to see a little bit more about how these types of giving people tend to do very well in life. And so it's no coincidence that our high profile and successful ladies have that trait amongst them. What about you, Lisa?
I would just go back. I mean, I think it's just a wonderful community, like the people that are in it and the advice that they give and the willingness to share. And just in case some of you don't know, it's not just within the podcast and their time where people are very generous, but they're generous afterwards to each other. And it's back to the theme of helping people out. But, women and men, but in this community really do reach out to one another. And it makes you feel very proud of being a part of all of this. And I think that it's just a really, it makes me, the pattern is, it's a great community. And I feel like it's a privilege to be a part of it. So the pattern is, I have yet to have a situation where I thought, I wasn't lucky to talk to the people or get to know them as part of the pattern afterwards. And they do the things that you say. But I think that pattern is, great. So for me on that.
And what's your biggest lesson learned or takeaway on a personal level from having hosted the podcast?
Well, I think that oftentimes I found a bit of my own voice and my ability to grow and to become someone who feels like they're more of a leader in this community, but in general. And I think it helps with confidence. Because I think a lot of us, we've talked about imposter syndrome or other things before. Sometimes you think in a room like, I'm less than some of the other people in there, or am I, is what I'm saying as important? It's really helped me build that. And it's also been a joy to me when I speak with people and they're, excited to talk to me about these things as well. So on a personal level, it's been it makes me think of empowering. It also makes me think about, we did this because as we said at the beginning, that we were excited about it. We thought it'd be fun. We thought it would be something, that we hoped people would listen to. And I feel so sort of excited, and I believe that it's like, if you're interested in something and you do something, it can grow or you can do things. So that's kind of my thing about it. That makes me excited. What about you?
Yeah, I love that. And I echo that excitement entirely. For me, it has been the knowledge, or I guess the reassurance that you have the ability to do so much. And how I think of it is, you and I were just two little buddies. We had nothing to do with podcasts before. We were not, our interviewing experience was solely related to compliance investigations. And I feel like we created something out of nothing. And that is an incredible accomplishment, given that this is just something that we do as a side gig. And if I could say, it was something that was so much bigger than ourselves. We initially thought it was just going to be a handful of people and had no way of knowing just how much of an impact that our initiative would have on other people, and then, of course, ourselves in turn. So the idea that you don't need to be a lot or be anything magnificent to be able to make change in this world. And for me, that's been the biggest lesson.
Yeah. I mean, one of the earliest questions was what people thought about, getting to the top. It's like, wait, people would like to hear our opinions of getting to the top. Well, I'm not even sure what that is, but it's different for everybody, but wow. So, I mean, it's a fantastic thing. I mean, that to me is a personal, level and takeaway on that. Following on that as well, though, is there something you weren't applying or identifying in yourself before, and now you recognize it in your practices or have grown from that in interviewing others?
Yeah. So I always felt, whether it was man or woman, that, overly blowing your own trumpet and being arrogant about accomplishments was very gauche. And one of the great things about our show is that I have had the opportunity to be exposed to fantastic role models. And what I have seen is people who unashamedly talk about the achievements that they have had that deserve to have a platform. And of course, that's the reason why we did it. But they're also very humble and very human. It's not at all distasteful when they share what they have accomplished in their careers and their personal lives. And so what I think I've become better at is not being so abashed about my own, not being shy to call attention if there's something that I am proud of. So for me, that's been a really great development opportunity, and I'm grateful for the women who have shown me that there are ways in which you can do it, which are not terrible. And I think it's something women do need to get better at. We know that traditionally men are much better at talking about their high performance than women are. So we need to get comfortable with this, and what better way than to see others who have gotten to that point do it themselves and see that it looks great. It looks like people have confidence in themselves, that they know their value. And so that would be my answer for that one. How about you?
Well, I mean, I think I have a similar feeling about that. How do you talk about or recognize your accomplishments? But I also think it's my voice. I think about it, and how do I use my voice in doing this for myself and for others? I think I didn't really identify, and I think it partially has to do with being part of this podcast, is now I do have an ability to, apply some of what I've learned here and some of the platform that we've been given to, be supportive to other people, or also to be able to talk about it in a way of, this is something that I put myself out there to do. And it's helped me think, because we've been able to get to this point, it gives me more, confidence and ability in that, not just to talk about accomplishments, but to go for certain things, go that way. And to also be able to share that, there, like you were saying, there are a lot of women who will say they won't apply for a job, or they're nervous, to be able to say, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? You don't get the job. Well, if you don't apply for the job, you're definitely not getting it. So what's the, and to sort of be able to share that in a way that I feel more comfortable with is just sort of one example for that. But I think that's a part of this. I wouldn't say that, I'm thinking about it saying, I've suddenly become more of an expert on, the FCPA. It's many other sorts of things that I've learned, the intangibles, or, working with people, being able to grow certain things. So that's kind of mine.
Awesome. And our next question is, have you had feedback from male listeners?
I'm going to give the big yes for both of us, and then you can add in. First of all, we've had feedback from male listeners. We have male listeners. We have males who suggest topics or guests or others, or just talk to us about different things. It's part of the community. And the two examples I wanted to mention is one, recently in one of the podcasts, the guest came from a guy who's a great guy in DC that I knew through exercise. And he said to me one day, how do you pick your guests? And said something to me about listening to the podcast. Well, that kind of blew me away. And then I had a similar experience with one of the senior male leaders at my company at Pearson, who referred to something they had heard in a podcast a few weeks earlier. So
fantastic.
We have, for me, I find not only do we have the listeners, we have these listeners who support women, but are also listening to this as a podcast to learn more about different topics and for women in the field. And so the answer is we have had feedback and good feedback and constructive feedback. What about you?
Yeah, to follow on from you, absolutely along a similar vein, one of the things that I've really loved has been when gentlemen approach us and chat about certain things from the podcast, and they're clearly listeners of ours or have listened to some episodes. And what I love about it is that even though I guess our specific niche area is the advancement and empowerment of women and highlighting their accomplishments, our male audience has imbued themselves, and they know it's a welcome place for them, that we invite everyone to participate and learn as much as they can, because of course we canvass a wide variety, I would say, of technical substantive compliance, as well as career development or soft skills type issues as well. And so what I've loved about that is that our male listeners have felt absolutely at home and know that the podcast is a place for them. While we do have a certain area of focus, it's not exclusionary in any way of men, and they have embraced that.
Yeah. So moving on to that, the feedback and male listeners from your podcasting experience, what have we learned about making podcasts? Mary, I'll let you start.
Yeah, a very technical one. So if you've ever wondered why there are sort of blips in our speaking in terms of if we stumble or make some sort of speech mistakes, why is it that it's not edited? So the very simple answer to that is that at the beginning, when we first started out, which was way back at the end of 2018, that time's gone so fast, we had professional producers to start off with to give us a bit of a leg up. And one of the things that they shared right at the beginning was that if you include things like your ums and your ahs and your stutters and your mistakes, that endears your audience to you, because it helps you establish rapport as being someone who is not perfect. You're not a robot or an automaton. And that seemed to be a good thing. So that's what I learned very early on, and it made me feel very comfortable, not being a perfectionist type of person, but also not wanting to sound like an absolute twit. It made me feel a lot more comfortable about that. What about you?
Well, first of all, one thing I have not learned about how to make podcasts, and I want to thank, you mentioned that we originally had some professional producers. We have an unofficial professional producer in Tom Fox, and I do not know how to edit. So when people ask me a lot of the technical questions about this, so some of, occasionally there will be parts to edit, and we'll say where they are, and we always want guests to feel like they didn't like how something went, just to be able to change that as well. But I've learned about, both the parts of it that seem more formal and more informal, different, what amount of time, what words, things like that. But in terms of some of the other things, I think, I've learned that in some ways it's easier than you expect, and then in some ways it isn't. But I also have to say that we haven't, I have not learned how to edit them, and I hope that doesn't become part of what I have to do in the future. So thank you to Tom Fox. So when people ask me a lot of technical questions about podcasts, I was like, do you know Tom? But so I've learned that. And I've also, learned a lot about using your own voice. I talked about it a minute ago, but being who you are in a podcast is really important. This is who we are. While we're talking now or when we talk to our guests. And, so I think that, that is something that, I have learned is growing my own voice in doing a podcast. So I think those are the couple things for me.
Yep. The only thing that I hold back on is expletives, because Tom will make me put a profane language warning up if I do. But otherwise, very much candid in myself, which is it's great to have a space where you can do that.
Yeah.
Excellent. And so the last of our solicited questions from our audience is, from your podcasting experience, what have you learned about making podcasts? No, we just covered that one. That is a great example of one of those things that we may or may not cut out. The next question is, and final question, what are you doing differently now compared with your first episode, or did you get it right immediately?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm thrilled that somebody thinks we've actually gotten it right now. I think we're doing well, but I always think there's room for improvement. But thank you for that. But we are definitely I'm doing things differently. I keep reflecting back on using my own voice, which I did at the beginning, but I feel much more comfortable conversationally, or if things go in a different direction that I had thought from, the prep work or an earlier conversation. I think it's much of a comfort level with that, and a comfort level with, my style and my communication ability. I wouldn't say I'm doing it differently. I think it's just evolved a bit. And to be able to do that is probably one of the things that to me has changed, and also, confidence in going into different topics that I may not have earlier on. So I think that those are a couple of things for me. What about you?
Yeah. So for me, it would be more interaction. So this episode is a great example of branching out from the structure or setup that we started with, and getting our audience involved in the program itself, which I've loved. And then again, in terms of collaboration, we've had some really great conversations with vendors in the industry who have expressed interest in partnering with us. And one of the awesome things is that, like us, they see this type of topic as not being one that should be a moneymaker, and genuinely seem to want to partner with us to help, bring together their audience and ours, to share a forum and do more work in this area. And one of the most obvious partnerships that we've had so far is with Corporate Compliance Insights, which has really been amazing for us, I think, in terms of cross-publicizing each other's services or offerings that we provide free of charge to people. So we're really aligned in what we like to do to help compliance officers. And of course, now there's the book project that we have going on, which I'm super excited about. So that's me on that one. And I think this brings us to our questions for each other.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you a question. As many of you know, Mary has lived on several different continents. So I'm wondering what country you want to end up in.
Yeah, the answer is a super easy and perhaps predictable one. So I see New Zealand as being a fantastic place, at the bare minimum, to retire. I expect to return to New Zealand as my place of domicile while I still have some working years left. That's, I think, ultimately where I'd like to turn up, but I never want to be very, how to say, I don't want to confirm things too far ahead, because there was a time when I never thought that I would leave Wellington, and I have totally busted that up. So at this stage, at this point in time, it would be New Zealand.
Yeah, well, New Zealand seems, that's like on my vacation list for the future when I can go somewhere again.
Well, you know that you always have a place to stay with me.
Perfect. I got getting travel plans done at the same time. So, Mary, what question do you have for me?
All right, Lisa. My question for you is, what is your dream job?
I actually, I'm thinking about that. I'm not sure there's a dream job. I think there are dream things I would like to do as part of a role. I think to continue being able to do, I care so much about ethics and compliance as a whole. It's not like I have this idea of I want it to be X company and X role in this, but I want to continue to be able to be a leader in the field, but to also be able to always be somewhere where it's being supported, and a place where we can be heard and creative and do the right thing, whether it's in ethics and compliance or sustainability or everything, but to continue with the responsibility of doing good and doing the right thing, and help be like a company, basically help be a company's conscience and help the employees do the right thing. I'm doing some of that now, but my dream is to be doing that in many different contexts and to grow it in that way. And I'm not sure what the job ultimately is. Is it a CCO? Is it something else? But the dream is to be able to do that and keep doing it in a sort of a larger way. Because I am kind of a nerd about what we do every day.
Yeah.
So I just like to apply it in different places and different things. I mean, there are some days, though, before we close off, that I would like to say I would be just as happy to, run a beach bar and give, compliance consulting advice along with the pina colada. But, for now, I think I'll stick with my, initial answer.
Well, I think those aspirations will resonate with a lot of people listening in. Thank you for sharing that.
So, well, thank you. We are out of the questions for our Ask Me Anything, and I want to thank everybody for that. Mary also mentioned earlier our Great Women in Compliance book. We hope that people will still send submissions if you haven't yet. We will repost the prompts and stuff soon, but please reach out to us or at our Gmail address, GWICPod, GWICPOD @gmail.com, if you would like to put in a submission or ask us other questions. And again, I want to say thank you, Mary, for doing this. This was so much fun. And to thank the Compliance Podcast Network and the Corporate Compliance Insights for supporting us. And I hope everybody has a safe and good week. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.